Good morning. I'm going to be discussing over the next 10 minutes assessing business risks and controls for the financial professional. I'm going to be focused entirely on environmental related risks. Let's just start with a discussion of risks in general. Risks are the uncertainties that can impact an organization's ability to meet its objectives. Risk is usually portrayed as the likelihood of bad events and the severity of those events. Because risks are always tied to an organization's objectives, uh, different organizations having different objectives are going to portray their risks differently. Risk management includes residual risk, which is the risk that remains after all existing risk controls that you have implemented have been put in place. Risk management encompasses the organization's actions to reduce its residual risks to an acceptable level. That can be risk avoidance, risk transfer, that can be certain controls that are being put in place. If the organization determines that through the implementation of these actions that the residual risk is still above an acceptable level, then additional controls may be required in order to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. Now we're going to turn to the liabilities associated with real estate lending. The reason that we're concerned about this has to do with some federal laws that were enacted a number of years ago having to do with the responsibility for cleaning up contamination on a piece of property. So the responsibility for the investigation and cleanup of contaminated sites is placed on what is referred to as the responsible party. That can include the party that actually caused the contamination, or it could include any subsequent property owners, even if they did not cause the contamination themselves. Since 2002, parties purchasing a piece of property that have conducted a Phase 1 environmental site assessment prior to purchase, which did not identify any issues, would not be considered a responsible party. This is often referred to as all appropriate inquiry. The 2002 law also addressed lender liability protection. This extended liability protection to lenders who acquire a contaminated piece of property through foreclosure. What the law said is that a lender that becomes the property owner through foreclosure would not be named a responsible party. So this provides some good liability protection for a lender. However, there's some residual liability that you need to be aware of. Because the lender is not a responsible party does not mean that the site is clean. Some investigation and cleanup may still be required. The responsibility for that will fall to the subsequent owner of the property. This is important to understand from the lender standpoint, is that it affects the value of the property that you foreclosed on, and it also affects the marketability of the property. Many lenders have become acquainted with these environmental issues through the SBA Environmental Procedure and Policies requirements. For the lender, SBA guaranteed loans are a form of risk transfer, which is certainly beneficial to the bank. However, SBA determined a few years ago that it could not meet its objectives without improving its controls to screen out high-risk properties. So now it requires a minimum level of environmental risk assessment for each transaction. Now, I've just earlier stated that a lender cannot be made a responsible party for site cleanup. The exception is important to understand. It has to do with petroleum site liability. The liability for the cleanup of leaking tank sites or lust sites falls to the owner of the tank. If a lender becomes a tank owner through foreclosure, meaning that there is a tank that's on the property that you have foreclosed on, the bank can be responsible for investigation and cleanup. Therefore, it's critical that all old tanks have been removed from a property and that any active tanks are well maintained. One of the most common questions we get in regards to environmental assessment is how long does the process take? So let me just go through the overall process and we'll turn that into time allocation that you should plan on. So a phase one environmental site assessment is the first step. It takes 2 weeks. If your phase one is taking longer than 2 weeks, then you should really question how the work is being completed. A phase one determines if there is the likelihood of contamination on the piece of property. And if there are no conditions, referred to as recognized environmental conditions, that suggest that it's likely that contamination exists, then the process ends with the phase one. However, if recognized environmental conditions are identified, the next step is phase two, sometimes referred to as a limited site investigation. You should plan on an additional 4 to 6 weeks if you have to go through a phase two process. Now, a phase two is going to be looking for indicators that contamination actually occurs on the property. It's an occurrence or absence of contamination. It is not a complete investigation of the entire site. If there is no contamination that's discovered during the phase two, then the process ends. However, if there is contamination that is discovered during a phase two site investigation, then quite often it has to be reported to the state agency. And once it's reported to the state agency, there's a number of decisions that would need to be made as to what the appropriate liability protections would be. You may be requesting certain liability protection letters from an agency. There may be some additional investigation and cleanup that's required. And we would like to see that any of these sites that go through this part of the process, that we can show that the contamination issue has been closed. Obviously, this adds some time to the overall environmental review. So let's go back and put these numbers together and determine what the lead time is that you should plan on in completing your environmental review. So if a phase one only ends up being required, so there are no recognized environmental conditions identified, you need to plan on 2 weeks to get that completed. However, if there are recognized environmental conditions and a phase two is required, you should be planning on 6 to 8 weeks in order to complete the phase two. If no additional or if no information is collected that shows that there's contamination on the property, then the process ends. However, if there is contamination discovered, and you need to go through a process of gaining liability protection letters, then the entire process extends to 11 to 14 weeks from start to finish. If there was additional cleanup that's required, quite often that takes a much extended period of time. Should plan on 6 months, and quite often it's longer than that. So I'm hoping that this short presentation has provided some good information on the liabilities that you address in the environmental review process. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Caltha LLP. We'll connect you with one of our environmental professionals and get your questions answered. Have a good day.